Okay, we're live, and I think we have the folks we're expecting.
Awesome. Well, welcome to our Commission on Racial Equity and Justice Economic Subcommittee meeting. Due to distance and health and safety concerns, members of the public are not in attendance at this meeting, but full access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication, allowing members of the public without cost to listen using streaming as available. The agenda for this meeting has been posted on the Public Square website and may be requested from the Office of the Governor by emailing Kate Davis at kansascrej@ks.gov. Each member of the commission and staff will state their name and title each time the individual begins to speak or voting so that the individual can be readily identified by remote listeners. All participants are required to ensure that microphones, phones, or other electronic devices are muted when the participants are not speaking, so the ability of remote listeners or observers to hear the proceedings is not unnecessarily impeded. Public comment will not be allowed at this meeting. During the meeting, the commission will not recess to a closed or executive session pursuant to KSA 754319. Each motion, if any, will be clearly stated before the committee, and the chairperson will announce the results of the final vote. As I said, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to be focusing specifically around tax policy, and we're going to start our session this afternoon with a presentation from the Governor's Council on Tax Reform. So thank you very much to Chris Courtwright and Kim Rubin and Josh McKinn for joining us. I will turn it over to the three of you, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves and sharing your presentation with us. Then we'll take questions from commissioners and have a general discussion.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm Chris Courtwright. I'm on the Governor's Tax Council. Prior to that, I had worked for 34 years as sort of the legislature's chief economist. No rest for the wicked, I guess. Right after I retired, the governor appointed me to her tax council. So I'm still doing a lot of the same things I did for many, many years. And Kim and her colleague, Aravind from the Urban Institute, some of whose work I'm going to cite here later, have joined us, and we're really excited to have them. I have to tell you, our friends from Urban and Brookings have been very, very valuable resources to us on the Tax Council. They're very networked into not just the latest research on tax policy, but on everything that's going on in Washington, D.C. And obviously, these are very exciting times with everything that's going on the federal level in terms of changes in tax law, upcoming infrastructure packages, you name it. So we rely on them heavily on the Tax Council. I guess my charge is to sort of kick things off and walk you through a PowerPoint. Kate and some folks from the governor's office had asked me to come in and update the commission on what the Tax Council has been doing, specifically with an eye towards seeing where there's some, exploring where there's some synergy and some mission overlap. And then also to talk about this really interesting question, and I'm going to touch briefly on it and then defer a little bit to Kim and the experts from Urban, this issue of whether there are racial disparities sort of inherent in state and local tax codes. That's an important question that has often been asked, and we'll talk a little about that. So I guess if I can figure out how to share my screen, I'll go ahead and start walking through the PowerPoint here. Okay. Does everyone have my screen on there now? Yeah. Okay. So basically, that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to go, and then Kim and the Urban can come in and back me up and put a finer point on some of the points I'm going to make. But I guess just to start out, obviously the commission has a very broad charge, and part of that charge clearly contemplates that it's appropriate for me to be here talking about tax policy. Certainly, it's part of tax policy is a system in Kansas. It's involved with economic opportunity. So sure, we should be talking, and frankly should have been here all along, our two bodies, the Tax Council and the Commission on Racial Equity and Justice. Okay, let's start to understand the genesis of the Tax Council. We have to talk a little bit about some history. Let's go back to 2012. As many of you know, our governor at that point in time championed some major changes in state tax law. And he said, rather famously, we're going to have an experiment. Okay. Well, he was right on that point. We did. The thing about experiments, though, sort of by definition, that they can be quantified and they can be measured. Okay. Well, what happened as a result of this experiment? Well, what happened is we really had what amounted to a budget catastrophe in Kansas that went on for a number of years. Here's pulled a picture off my cell phone, I guess. Here's a picture of me standing in a room at the State House explaining a many hundreds of millions of dollars shortfall to a room full of angst-filled legislators and reporters and everybody else. Somewhat symbolically, I'm standing between the then future governor and then current governor while talking about all of this in about 2015. Well, let's talk about what happened with some of these tax policy changes. For many, many years, Kansas had a 3-bracket individual income tax system. And you can see there in the left-hand column, they were 3.5, 6.25, and 6.45. Everybody was comfortable with those. That structure had been in place for 20 years. But you can see what happened with the 2012 law change is the top bracket was repealed altogether. They collapsed the 3-bracket system into a 2-bracket system. Okay. And you can see the rates were just 2.7 and 4.6. And they also repealed the tax altogether on non-wage business income. So the rate was effectively 0 on anything that you or your accountant could construe as non-wage business income. Okay, so this included royalty income, consulting income, farm income. And if you were the type of business who could set yourself up as one of these sole proprietorships, LLCs, subchapter S corporations, if you were a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist, a real estate agent, if you were one of those kinds of people, you could file some paperwork with the Secretary of State and set yourself up as that kind of business entity and pay yourself out of your business's profits and construe it as non-wage business income. So those kind of people, they weren't paying the state any income taxes for 4 years. Their rate went to 0 and everybody else's rates went down. And as I said, the top bracket was repealed altogether. We went to a 2-bracket system. Well, this did not work from the outset. What had happened is, contrary to what many proponents of the tax experiment had promised, as I mentioned, we saw a massive collapse in revenues. So in 2013 and 2015, the legislature, in response to this, had to enact backfilling tax increases, okay, because this experiment had not worked out the way that the proponents had hoped. But you can see here on this slide, some of those backfilling things that were enacted in 2013 and 2015 in particular made the situation even worse. There were 2 increases in the sales tax. The cigarette tax was increased. Those are probably 2 of the most regressive taxes, right? They're harder on the poor than they are the well-to-do. We'll talk more about this in a minute. The food sales tax rebate credit program was made non-refundable. Kansas is one of the few states that fully taxes food, right? We pay sales tax on groceries, but in acknowledgement of that, what Kansas had always kind of done is said, all right, look, even we're going to give you a fully refundable credit. So even if you don't otherwise have any income tax liability in Kansas, even if you're a low or moderate income person who doesn't pay the state any income taxes, we're going to go ahead and send you back a check for a couple $100. if you file an income tax return anyway, a fully refundable credit to acknowledge that during the prior tax year, you paid sales tax on your groceries all year. So we had this program that sort of went to some of the folks who were most harmed by having paid sales tax on their groceries. But that program was, the refundability part of that program was totally repealed. Also, we have a homestead property tax relief program. And like most states that have something like that, again, a way of getting some property tax relief to some low and moderate income people. Most states that have those allow renters to participate, okay? Renters were kicked out of the homestead program. The food sales tax refundable credits were repealed. There were 2 increases in sales and cigarette tax. So all these things had happened. It isn't just that the progressivity of the income tax was reduced because we went to a 2-bracket system and the non-wage people weren't paying any taxes, but the regressive taxes were raised. Okay, so basically, besides the revenue crisis, all of these changes together brought us, besides the fiscal woes, there were new equity issues, right? As I mentioned, we repealed the income taxes for the non-wage business income. There were major rate cuts. The top bracket was repealed altogether. We cut the food rebate credit program. And so at the bottom line is the receptionist with the pounding headache answering the phones when the barking dog come into the waiting room at the vet's office, she's still paying taxes because she earns wages, right? She's a wage earner. But the tax exempt veterinarian is not paying any taxes, right? Here's fun with cut and paste on the internet. There's the happy tax exempt veterinarian visiting with a client, but you can see the receptionist has a headache, right? Picture tells the story there on that particular equity issue. Okay, so let's talk about what ultimately happened in 2017. The fiscal crisis had become ongoing and institutionalized. And by 2017, the legislature said, look, we're tired of this. Every year when we come to town, there's backfilling tax increases on the table. There's budget cuts. There's smoke and mirrors, budget games. We're stealing money from the highway program. We're not making payments into the state pension system. The foster care, social services are falling apart. The fiscal crisis has become ongoing and institutionalized. We need to fix this. The experiment has failed. And really, what they did at that point in time is they said, all right, we're going to have to go back to a 3-bracket system, and we're going to have to repeal this exemption for the non-wage people because that costs us way more than what everybody thought it would. Right, so this is what they did, and rather remarkably, they enacted this over the former governor's veto. They passed this, he vetoed it. They came up with 2/3 legislative majorities that included a number of Republicans in both the House and the Senate, and they rammed this veto down his throat. They overrode his veto. And you can see in the far right, we're now back to a 3-bracket system. The rates are 3.1, 5.25, and 5.7. But the current law brackets, by the way, even though we're back to a 3-bracket system and they undid a lot of this, they're still lower than they were for 20 years. They're still lower in the far right-hand column than they were the rates everybody was used to paying for many, many years. So I think taxpayers still, arguably sort of came out ahead on all of this. Okay, let's take a quick look at the most regressive of our major tax sources. Here's the history of the sales tax in Kansas. And the reason I bring this up is because, as we all well know, it isn't just the state sales tax. Cities and counties have had the ability to put sales taxes on in Kansas since the 1970s. And it's not uncommon to pay 9 to 10% or even higher sales tax, combined state and local, when you buy something in this state, right? Well, that gets us to the next issue that we talked about, and that is the sales tax on groceries issue. Kansas, as I mentioned, is one of the few states that applies its full sales tax rate to groceries. As I mentioned, we sort of acknowledge that we had this fully refundable credit available since 1978. But part of one of the so-called pay-fors in the 2012 tax law to pay for all these income tax cuts, the governor said, well, let's do away with the refundable credit. Let's repeal that. So that was repealed. in 2012. And so certainly that, as we've discussed, made the overall tax system that much more regressive, because there was no ability for a lot of people to get any kind of relief for paying 9-10% state and local sales tax on their groceries. All right, well, that leads us into the history. These issues of equity, progressivity, regressivity, and food sales tax, of course, had been discussed for many, many years, but they really became even more front and center after Governor Kelly was elected, right? She was elected in 2018, and so she set up the Tax Council in 2019. She set us up with an executive order similar to what she did for the commission. And our general charge was really sort of two-pronged. We wanted to look at the overall adequacy of the system, right? Is there enough money coming in? Did the 2017 veto override, what kind of damage was done to the public sector? We need to be careful about a new round of tax cuts because we're still recovering from the last round. So there was some notion of what kind of adequacy is there in the system, but also, of course, the equity issues, right? Everybody knows that the whole system was made more regressive, harder on low and moderate income people. The original plan was for the council to issue a report in December of 2019, after it had been a few months, saying, look, generally, we think this is the way you ought to go. And then we were supposed to meet all throughout 2020 and make a final report in December of 2020, sort of to the incoming 2021 Kansas legislature, was the idea. The initial report that we did issue in December of 2019 said, yeah, the whole progressivity, regressivity thing was really a problem. We made a number of recommendations, especially we said, you got to make the food sales tax credit fully refundable again. You need to restore that. Also, there was this three-legged stool notion. For many, many decades, policymakers in both parties had said, we think a balanced three-legged stool is the way to go. Sales, income, and property taxes are the three major tax sources. And there's some thinking that having all of them about co-equal in terms of burden is better than just having all your eggs in one or two baskets. So they wanted to re-embrace the three-legged to the stool notion, as opposed to sort of the Brownback era, where people were demanding to do major amputation surgery on what was the shortest leg of the stool, which was the income tax leg in 2012. So that was the initial report. And the 2020 session got here, and really it was hard to give it a full grade except incomplete, right? The whole COVID crisis truncated the 2020 session. It obviously created a whole new set of public sector demands amid collapsing tax receipts and reduced resources. So the governor in November basically gave us another year. She said, look, you guys, at this point, all bets are off. You're going to need another year to help us digest the latest economic and revenue forecasts, as well as continuing talking about the right tax reform proposals, given the still emerging realities of COVID and the fact that so much of it is ongoing. The second Tax Council report that we issued in sort of over the holidays, we did issue our second of what will now be three annual reports. We put language in there that said, all right, a great many medium and long run social costs have yet to be realized that are going to obviously continue to provide additional stress on government at all levels. We even found some research going back 100 years ago that said, look, probably not surprising to us today, right? But there was some research that found that there were significant mental health costs a decade later from the 1919 flu pandemic. That shouldn't surprise any of us right now. And obviously, there's many, I'm afraid, many a master's thesis that's going to be written on things we haven't even thought about yet, right? Children who've lost a parent, what are the long-term social costs are going to be for that kind of thing. I heard something on the news just today that as many as 1/3 of people who had COVID and recovered have now been diagnosed with some kind of mental health issue 6 months later. there's just a million of these things. The ongoing costs of this are staggering, and that's going to put great additional ongoing stress on public sector. So we said, all right, look, we still think it's important to look at tax reform, but obviously whatever is going to be enacted here in 2021, the amount of tax cuts in terms of dollars is going to have to be pretty modest at this point. We now have a new fiscal crisis to deal with, but we said all the more reason, whatever tax cuts might be on the table, target them to the people who need them the most. Okay, that was an important part. So we said, again, do the food sales tax rebate credit thing. We made a few other recommendations. We also, by the way, weighed in strongly behind the inclusion of state and local aid as part of the American Rescue Plan that was approved here by Congress early in 2021. I wrote a couple of op-eds. The Tax Council, we memorialized our congressional delegation to support that provision. Only one member of our legislation did. It was Representative Davids. Everybody else said no. They didn't vote for the bill, specifically because of the money that was going to come to the state and locals. They claimed we didn't need it, which is wrong. Someone who worked for the state for 34 years, I can assure you the states and locals need that money for any number of reasons. The thing I've been talking about a lot is progressivity and regressivity. And you might think, well, Chris, that's great. We all know about that, but aren't there any more really specific research or metrics to get better handles on racial disparities in the tax code? And this is where the folks from Urban come in. The answer is not really. It turns out the IRS and state departments of revenue don't really require filers to identify race or ethnicity. So really drilling down and understanding exactly how racial disparities intersect with taxes can be a challenge. Some of these distributional estimates of all these special nuances in the tax code, like exemptions and deductions and credits, those aren't really broken out by race or ethnicity either. So sometimes there's efforts made to take what tax data are out there and marry them up with Census Bureau data and some other kinds of things, but it's not an exact perfect fit like we would like, right? We're pretty sure we know the outlines that what we're talking about, and it's tough. We believe that reduced regressivity and increased progressivity will almost always be better and help reduce what racial inequities are out there. And this is a quote from our friends from Urban who are on the call with us. But basically, they're making the point here that, look, we know that white households have disproportionately larger incomes and concentrations of wealth. And so that's going to mean generally, pretty much all, most tax policy changes you're going to want to evaluate, it's going to be almost always better to, if you increase income or wealth, that's going to be more effective. There are tax rates that do increase with income or wealth, like income taxes do. More brackets, the better, makes it more progressive. That's going to be more effective in closing gaps, not just across the income levels, but also across racial and ethnic groups. That's a logical conclusion that virtually all of us in the profession adhere to. But it's, again, we wish it could be just a little bit more precise. So even as the feds can't quite demonstrate this premise with 100% conclusively, states and locals are even less likely to have the data and sophistication to bring the whole race and to address the whole race and tax policy question. Here's again more quoting from our friends from Urban, and they mention here that the Biden administration's executive order on racial equity could help increase the extent of data available and the procedures undertaken by agencies when considering tax policies. And this can ultimately, there's better data that will help not just the feds, but states and locals in looking at this whole issue. Well, boy, what executive order? What are we talking about? Well, it turns out on his very first day in office, President Biden issued this executive order on advancing racial equity and support for undeserved communities through the federal government. It set up this special working group to improve federal data collection. It's got a couple of cabinet secretaries in there, statisticians, and the OMB, Office of Management and Budget, is supposed to work with all federal agencies to identify the best approaches for measuring equity and how to increase it. So a really significant executive order. I will tell you, I've read this over a number of times. This is really fascinating to me. Kim's colleagues at Brookings published this. I think it was from a blog or something just a few days after the executive order came out. And it's got a very exciting premise. It basically says, all right, in addition to the executive order, think about this just a little more. OMB should, in fact, establish a separate, discrete, unique scoring system to measure not just the fiscal impact, but equity. Establish methods to measure and evaluate policy outputs as they relate to racial economic inclusion, as well as civic engagement and social equity. Basically, the bottom line, to me, what this says is, if a piece of proposed policy at the federal level, we think we know it costs $20 billion. Okay, well, we want to be able to disaggregate that $20 billion impact by race and ethnicity, but also even more broadly, we want to somehow measure equity via some medium and long run metrics. In other words, sort of bring the whole implications of a public policy change together. Just bringing things back to Kansas. Remember, we talked about how all of the net changes in tax policy that happened from 2012 through 2015 made it much more regressive, less progressive, more regressive. And we know that probably exacerbated, made worse the racial disparities. But then really, as a result of the fiscal hit to the state because of that, because of the stress on the public sector and what happened as a result of that, it's probable, even likely, that that fallout caused even worse racial disparities, right? In other words, cuts to social services, cuts to infrastructure, you name it. It isn't just that the tax system became more regressive, but the public sector impact likely made it even worse. So that particular story had 2 chapters to tell, okay? And I guess ultimately, if this recommendations from Brookings and Kim and her folks may talk a little about this, can be implemented, it's really, really exciting stuff that people are thinking about doing this. And I would love to see this rolled out at the federal level. And then if we could extend it on down to sort of state and local tax policy as well. Really a provocative idea. And I've been thinking about this a lot since Kim sent me some of these articles and research. Okay, real quick, let's talk about the immediate future in Kansas. The current tax cut package on the governor's desk, not much in there would help working class Kansans. There is a standard deduction increase that would help most filers, not a lot in terms of dollars. The far more expensive itemized deduction option, we know, would primarily benefit only the wealthiest 18%. There's some other corporate stuff in there and whatnot. Some of the other policy options that designed to reduce regressivity have not, unfortunately, been gaining traction this session, including the refundable food sales tax rebate credit bill. There's a bill out there, it's not moving, or restoring renters to the homestead program. There's a new sort of homestead program aimed specifically at seniors that would kind of freeze their property taxes. It would be a new proposal, but my understanding is that also does not include renters, right? So not a lot going on that we would be pleased with right now in the 2021 session. There is ongoing controversy and confusion over the federal prohibition against state tax cuts. The good news is the feds did put the money in the American Rescue Plan for states, but we cannot use the money for tax cuts. You can't use it to make extra payments into your pension programs, and you cannot use it for tax cuts. And state attorneys general have sued over this, and there's a million different interpretations. What the federal law says to me is that for every tax cut we pass, we're going to have to double it, right? If we pass a tax cut of $100 million, I think we then have to send back $100 million to the feds. So that the net hit to the state will be $200 million of that $100 million tax cut. That's what it says to me. So if that's the way this thing's going to work, we really want to be sure that the tax cuts are, we're getting our bang for their buck for them, or we're targeting them to where they're going to. So that's on the table. That's still being sorted out. In the meantime, the legislature is supposed to go home here in a day or two and take their April recess. And the revenue forecasting group reconvenes on April 20th. At that point in time, they're going to factor in all changes in law in both Kansas and federal law since November, changes in the economic outlook. One of the changes in law they need to factor in is this PPP fiscal note. The Paycheck Protection Program forgiven loans are exempt, but businesses can now, in fact, deduct certain expenditures paid with those already tax exempt loans. And that was not in the law when the consensus group met last November. Factoring that in is going to knock $360 million for that provisional loan out of the state general fund receipt estimates. Now, the good news is that hasn't happened yet, and some of the major tax sources are up relative to collections through March, but all of this stuff is going to go into the new secret sauce, and then how the new federal money fits in is going to go in there as well, I guess. And they're going to leave the room on April 20th with a new set of numbers. Then the lawmakers are scheduled to return on May 3rd for their so-called veto or wrap-up session. So the tax council, we met last week, and we're going to meet again in either late April or early May, right before or right after the legislature reconvenes, to help continue giving the governor and anyone else who wants to listen guidance about what we think would be good tax policy. And I will tell you that the governor's office and our tax council co-chairs they're glad you invited me today. I'm glad you invited me today, but they're also excited about our collaboration, and they've asked me to invite someone from your group to appear at our next meeting to sort of reciprocate and start building our ongoing partnership and provide us with your thoughts on how tax policy can help further goals of racial equity. So it's neat. We'll be able to hopefully start working together more collaboratively here moving forward. Also, I would mention to you, I traded some emails with my friends I think I got this from the Kansas Action for Children people. They're great over there. They're very networked in on this stuff. There is I'm not familiar with the Colorado Fiscal Institute. It may well be sort of a sister organization similar to our Kansas Action for Children group. I think they advocate for, more progressive tax policy, but they're having a seminar that you guys are able to register for. If you want to see what someone else is saying about everything we've just been talking about, someone from your group can sign up for this seminar, and I've got the link here if you're interested. It's sometime on April 20th. Gets into the same issues of racial disparities and inequities in the tax code. With respect to resources, and the folks from Urban are going to be on here in just a second. So I mentioned that they're just wonderful resources on all these kinds of issues. If you guys ever do take testimony or want to continue to sound out some of the people I've been working with and talking to, a lot of the folks from our Kansas Action for Children group are great. And also, if you want to talk about good tax policy, you should always talk to my friend, Sister Therese Bangert. She is a tireless advocate for expansion of the earned income tax credit. And she's just wonderful. She's been doing this for 20 years, appearing at the State House on behalf of good tax policy, and the legislature would be well served to listen more to Sister Therese, I think, and less to some of the more well-paid lobbyists. Okay, the links are here to some of the research I've cited, if anybody likes to cut and paste. And I guess I would just close before I hand things off to Urban, and then we can stand for questions. I guess I was visiting with Josh, and one of the recommendations from the commission's report was that better data and transparency could improve policing, right? Well, same kind of thing we're talking about tax policy. Kind of my conclusion, better data and transparency can improve tax policy. I think the same sort of principle applies to what we're talking about here. With that, I'll hand it off to Urban Institute, and then I think we're happy to pause for any questions.
Thanks. Thanks, Chris. I don't know if you want to get rid of your screen or not. So I have no.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
No. So I just wanted to add a few additional comments. Arvind Bodapalli, who's my co-author on this work, is also on the line. We've been working closely with the Kansas Tax Commission. We've been doing work like that before. I've done a lot of work. I was on the commission for DC when they did their tax revision before. And so some of the lessons I'm going to talk about are related to that. So first, I just sort of want to reiterate a couple of the things that Chris said. In general, we haven't paid a lot of attention to the racial and ethnic implications of changing tax policy, in part because we don't have the data. So just because something says it's race neutral does not mean it does not affect people of different races or ethnicities differently. And just because we can't measure it doesn't mean it's not happening. And so as a first step, it's really important to note that there are differences across groups, and that tax policy and the fact that we do a lot of our fiscal policy, and especially a lot of our welfare policy through the tax code, means that you can have disparate implications, and you can use the tax system to try and mitigate income inequality or wealth inequality, not only across groups by income levels, but also between racial and ethnic groups. And so sort of to start with, knowing that the tax system can help or hinder things is a big deal, and that it isn't necessarily neutral. And so what does that mean in practice? So the first part is, in general, because there are disparities by income and wealth across different racial and ethnic groups, if you have policies that are more progressive or that tax higher income people more, you're going to end up closing some of those gaps across races or ethnicities as well, just because of the disparities that are there. But not everything that we see is directly related to income, right? There are differences across groups, and part of this has to do with earlier discrimination that isn't just captured by differences in income. One of the most notable things is home ownership, right? Because of redlining and historical discrimination, you have much lower home ownership rates in African-American communities than you do in white communities. And so any of the policies that we have in place that are favoring homeowners rather than renters is going to increase those disparities. And so, for example, right now, the mortgage interest deduction is only useful for people who are itemizing. And because only higher income people are itemizing right now, that's going to make it less useful for Black and Latino families. And also the fact that they're less likely to own homes means that that's also going to be increased disparities there. So if you were going to try and do something to encourage homeownership, in general, we think things like first-time homeowner credits would work better, and they would also help level the playing field across races and ethnic groups in terms of who owns homes. So if you sort of could shift from, and this is more at the federal level, given a lot of these things piggyback at the state level, but if you move to something like a first-time homeowner credit, that would actually be more effective in trying to help some of these groups rather than having something for the mortgage interest deduction. And it would also be more helpful in terms of helping people get into homeownership if that's the goal, rather than the current mortgage interest deduction, which might just encourage people to take on more debt, which isn't really anything we would want to have happen. In work we did in DC, part of what we were doing when we were trying to figure out how to change their tax code was we also spent a lot of time focusing on the earned income tax credit. So this is something that generally helps lower income families. But we also found in DC, because there were a number of especially African-American men who weren't necessarily not part of families, but they weren't living or married to or living in the same home with their children. We found that by expanding the value of the earned income tax credit for childless workers, we could actually target that and help encourage especially young African-American men to join the labor force. And so in part, because that's a credit right now, the earned income tax credit largely goes to families with children, but there is a small federal credit that is for people without children. That at the federal level, you need to be over 25 to get it. In DC, we expanded it, so it could actually be for people under 25. And we, instead of having it be a 40% match rate, which is what the general match rate is in DC for their earned income tax credit, it was increased to 100%. So that just meant that we were targeting money from DC to a population that, one, we were trying to encourage to enter the labor force, and also people who, even if they weren't living in the same home with their kids, often had children. And so it was basically a way of incentivizing behavior that we were hoping to see through the tax code. And you can imagine other things like that. So other things that DC does that are encouraging, and get back to this whole issue of home ownership versus renters, is the DC property tax credit is actually refundable credit and isn't just for people who own their homes. It's actually available for people who are renters. And so that's a way that DC is pushing money out to people who aren't homeowners, but who are actually having to pay higher rent because property taxes might be higher. And so there are ways that you can change the tax system, and especially change some of these credits or tax expenditures, or how we're spending tax revenues to try and encourage or discourage certain behaviors in a way that can have disparate impacts for people who are at different points in the income distribution, but who can also have disparate impacts for different racial or ethnic groups. Another thing where we see states trying to affect some of these disparities is California actually allows people who have ITINs rather than Social Security numbers to get their earned income tax credit. So people with ITINs are people who aren't documented, so they aren't necessarily entitled to work by having a Social Security card, but often they are working and they are paying taxes. And this is a way of getting them some relief as well. And so there were things like that, that as we think about tax reform, you can tweak your tax system to try and make it more helpful for different groups, or at least acknowledge the fact that certain groups are more or less likely to benefit from some of the things that are currently in the tax system as it now stands. The other thing I wanted to add to what Chris said, when we sort of think about the changes in the income tax system in Kansas, one of the problems, and part of what makes it hard, and we have a brief that looks at sort of how taxes paid vary across states and what the composition of taxes are. Unlike the federal government that can run deficits, the fact that taxes in tend to match spending out, it means that it's harder to just look at the tax side and not look at the spending side as well. So part of the thing that becomes really problematic is if you cut your income tax revenues in, does that affect how much you can pay for schools? And so part of the impetus for the reform and the override of the governor's veto of expanding the income tax back out was actually the fact that there needed to be more money for schools. And especially if you look at the demographic component of kids versus adults in different places, you actually find that a disproportionate number of kids tend to be Black or Latino in states as compared to people who are seniors. So the amount of money that gets sort of shifted towards kids away from older populations can also have a disparate effect by race or ethnicity. Sorry, and I'll stop there, and we're happy to take any questions. Arvind, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Maybe just one thing to highlight would be that before we did the work on the state and local level, we also made an interactive feature called Racial Disparities in the Income Tax System. And for folks who are not as well equipped with thinking about race when you think about taxes, that can be a good primer, basically laying out line by line item on the individual tax form. What does this have to do with race? How much does it cost the federal government? Why does this matter? And how could you reform it? So we talk about education, we talk about retirement, we talk about wages, we talk about family structure, we talk about social security number versus ITIN. So we basically lay out about 20 different ways in which race and taxes intersect. So that can be a primer for folks.
Kim, it looked like you were trying to add something, but you were muted.
Oh,
No, I was just saying we can add it. There was a question in the chat. And Arvind, I'm going to make you add it to the chat because you're more competent at this than I am.
perfect. Thank you.
This is John Nave, Kansas FL-CIO. You know, these steps that you've kind of educated us on have this been done in educating some of our elected officials that have some positive proposals at what you're saying? Do they know the implications of, or the impact that, good or bad, that this has on on our state, but more importantly, educate them in a way to say, hey, let's fight for these type of changes? Or what can we do, or labor leaders do across the state to educate our members the impact of the things that we should be pushing to candidates, so we can get those candidates elected, so we can get some of those tax reforms back into the state to where it benefits working families, particularly people of color.
And we're happy to talk to different people. I want to reiterate something Chris said. So the Center for Budget, CBPP, has been doing a lot of work on these topics, and their state groups are also amplifying that. So there are people we work with pretty closely, and they've also put out reports sort of highlighting, especially at the state and local level, there is a racist history, especially in more southern states, behind what the tax system looks like. Like there was, when we actually ended up getting into Reconstruction, there was a shift away from property taxes to sales taxes. And part of that was implicitly racist in places to do that, to try and increase the burden on certain populations. So they do a lot of good work. A lot of their state partners are highlighting this. I know California just put something out. So the California Center just put out something that sort of highlights 5 ways that they could reform taxes in a way that would help with these questions as well. A lot of this comes down to, if you could sort of have more progressive taxes or taxes on wealth, it would help. And then any sort of credits that are targeted for lower income families can especially help. But there is work being done, and there are resources available that we're happy to share, and we're happy to talk to elected officials. Urban doesn't have a lobbying part, so we need to be invited to go talk to people in a way that some of our partners at CBPP have an easier time doing that.
Thank you.
The other thing I would say, John, is just to think about the issue kind of advocacy thing. Well, just to drill down for a second into the whole grocery issue, that's very important. The groceries represent about 15% of the sales tax base, right? If we were to do like other states did back in the 1930s, when a lot of sales taxes were put on, if we were to exempt groceries at this point from sales tax, it would cost many, many hundreds of millions of dollars. The state simply cannot afford that. And everybody acknowledges that. So sometimes they're, well, okay, let's take 1 cent off, right? Well, okay, each 1 cent is worth around $60 million. All right, well, if people are paying 9.5% for their groceries now, and we knock it down to 8.5%, that's not going to help a lot of people all that much. And the people that are driving to Missouri to buy their groceries anyway, because they don't charge much tax over there, are probably going to keep doing it. So the idea is, if there's really $60 million laying around to address the problem, that's about how much the restored refundable food sales tax credit costs, right? Let's not, the argument was back in the day, I think he still does, the argument was George Brett lives in Kansas, right? George Brett can afford to pay sales tax on his groceries. So let's not drop George Brett's sales tax a penny. And instead, let's send these $200 or $300 credits out to the families that most need it, who are, everybody's going to keep paying the 9.5%. So it's an issue of targeting, but you're also right. It's an issue of electoral politics. And we're helping advise the governor on as many tax policy fronts as we can, sales, income, and property. And we put out a little mini report or press release after every meeting. And sometimes she takes all of our recommendations, and sometimes she takes some of them or most of them. But it's an ongoing struggle, as you know, and some of the folks driving the bus in my former branch of government are of the mindset that existed around 2012, that they want to try another round of tax cuts, notwithstanding the spectacular failure of the previous experiment.
If we had a template that we could have that would say, break it down into layman terms where members could hear this message, I think maybe we could start to put something, together that can help put the right people in the right seat, or give them the right, give them the education to give our members the education to put pressure on some of the elected officials across the state.
The other part of this that gets interesting, and it's sort of not necessarily on the tax side, but on the spending side, if we think about something like the American Rescue Plan and some of this focus on wanting to know who is benefiting or who is affected by different things, it will be really interesting. And if we could move to a place where we actually have the information about who's benefiting from certain plans. So if places are going to take that money and do economic development, what neighborhoods is it going on in? Who's actually getting those loans? We don't necessarily know who got the PPP loans, right? So there is some indication that it worked better in some places than others. In some states, it seemed like really large companies got that money rather than small businesses. It feels like Kansas may have been a little bit better just because of where your banks are and who has those relationships. But to whatever extent that the federal rules and this sort of focus on looking at equity can get us better information to know and to make places list where that money actually goes, that's going to be super important. And especially in the kinds of work you're doing to try and understand this. I also feel like this is new. So DC did tax reform. I did that probably 5 or 6 years ago. We were looking at equity. We were largely focused on income. We did a little bit about race, but it wasn't sort of part of what we were basically told to do. They're doing tax reform again, and DC now has a similar committee to what you're doing in terms of saying that as they're moving through things, they need to figure out what the racial and ethnic implications are of different policies that are going on. So the fact that you exist is sort of putting you sort of at the forefront of where things seem to be going in this area. And so for that, I would recommend you, and it's hard, but to the extent that we could get better data, it can help make better decisions.
This is Chair Shannon Portillo. I am really excited about the better data piece, and I was incredibly excited to see Biden's executive order around data. Is there I think that will help us a lot at the federal level. Is there something similar that we can kind of request of Governor Kelly from the state level to help us move forward with better data? I heard, that we need an expansion, better data and better transparency to improve tax policy. I completely agree with that. But I also want us to be a little bit more specific in what do we say, what would better data really look like? What does transparency really look like? Because I think sometimes when we say transparency, it's been used to scare people with big numbers so that they don't want to pay their taxes. I'm thinking about like SB 13. Part of the transparency there is now every county has to mail out an overview of what taxes are, which is great for people to see, but it's also positioned right in front of a public hearing so that people can, as a county commissioner, people can come yell at us and say we don't want to pay that, which is fine. I think the transparency piece overrides all of the negatives that could potentially come of it. But are there pieces of data that we really need? Are there ways that we can really make sure that we get the transparency that helps folks see how these policies are put in place, how their tax dollars are being used? And I think things like the groceries make up 15% of all sales tax that are collected. So here's where a rebate makes more sense than getting rid of the grocery sales tax. Those are things that I don't think the general public is really aware of, but have huge implications for racial equity in our state.
Shannon, I guess I've got several responses to that. First of all, again, we're very much looking forward to what the feds are going to develop. And our Department of Revenue has some reciprocity arrangements with the IRS. I think it's possible ultimately, whatever metrics are developed about broader equity measures at the federal level, we will be able to try and apply them to state tax policy discussions. One potential problem with that is it's always been tough to do a real good cost benefit analysis on tax breaks and exemptions and deductions and credits in the tax code. And the reason involves confidentiality, right? There's very tough language in the tax code that says the Department of Revenue can't identify individual specific taxpayers, or it's actually a crime if they do so. Okay. Well, one sort of provides, there's several states that used to do this. I'm pretty sure it hasn't happened anymore, but back in the 70s and 80s, there was a couple states, I think maybe Minnesota was one of them, that had a policy that said, all right, if you're gonna claim some exemption or credit or deduction, that's an expenditure of public funds. That's a public record. We're gonna have to do cost benefit analysis on this. So if you're a business and you're whining about how if you're claiming 15 job expansion and investment credits, and that's proprietary information that your competitors can use against you, and you're alarmed by the fact that turns up in a public document, don't claim the credits, guys. That's sort of the way things used to work. But boy, good luck getting that passed in Kansas. So it is a problem. The only other point I would make is ultimately we're having some discussions with state officials more on the expenditure side of the equation because of the controversy with the money that came to the states and locals from the American Rescue Plan. We're going to want to monitor a little bit. And so if people say, oh, that money was just wasted, it was spent on stupid stuff. No, here's what it was spent on. We're going to try and maintain a database to show, look, the states and the cities and counties really did need this money. And from the tax council standpoint, we're encouraging people to use it for debt reduction or capital improvements or sort of one-time infrastructure projects, because it's a one-time shot in the arm of money, right? If you use it to cut taxes, you got to raise taxes again next year, right? So you want to take advantage of the money that has come in to do sort of one-time things. And so we're talking about building a little bit of a database that can help monitor that prospectively.
This is Commissioner McCormick. I want to congratulate you all on such an informative and engaging presentation today. I've really enjoyed it. I have a million questions, but I only asked two. I remember you talking about renters and homeowners and trying to steer people in that direction. I was doing some research for a presentation, and I found an article that said that African Americans were starting businesses at twice the national rate. I wonder if business ownership is a way to do the very same thing. And then switching gears a little, I've always been curious about the impact the lottery and gaming has in terms of the tax base. So two very different questions. And thank you again for a great presentation.
And so I would say that part of what would be really interesting is knowing how money that is targeted for businesses, how many go for new and startup businesses versus existing businesses. Something I was going to say off of what Chris said, and I don't know if this is possible, but I don't know if there are any like economic development or business loans that are sort of focused on women or minorities within Kansas, and whether there might be a way of linking that information to information on credits, where then you could at least know something if it's kept confidential. So you're not saying who the specific money is going for, but if there's a certain amount of tax expenditures in the Kansas code saying what share of that money went to people who are a female or minority owned business, right? There are ways that it might be possible. And Chris, you would know this better than me because I don't want to make problems for the people who have access to the data, but it might be possible to link data across things as long as it's not released publicly, where it could at least see whether, you know, a disproportionate amount of that money is or is not going to groups that might be getting other things. In general, the lottery is generally played by lower income families and generally is more likely to be played by minority families. So I think in general, in some of the research that's done, not using administrative data, but using things like the current population survey or things that look at activities that people are underway, we generally find that lower income families and minorities tend to disproportionately play it and use that money, which is why in places where they earmark that money for higher education, that seems especially problematic given minorities are less likely to go to school and get something like the Hope Credit in Georgia. So you just sort of knowing how money is coming in and where it's going feels really important. And it gets kind of naughty. Like I've done some work looking at sugar sweetened beverages. And so soda taxes are something that is going to disproportionately be paid by minorities because of who's buying soda. But if that money is then targeted for programs that are helping, and it also might have some health benefits, it could be okay, right? So this is also why it's not clear whether we should be opposed or in favor of cigarette taxes. If it can actually get people to stop smoking, that's a pretty big positive. But you do want to recognize that the people who are paying it tend to be lower income. And so it could be disproportionately burdensome. So you'd like that money to be spent on things that would also benefit those populations.
This is Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. Thank you guys so much for your presentation. You made a very boring subject seem extremely awesome. So great job to all of you on that. You kept my attention. That's saying a lot. Kim, to your statement, in the taxes, we're not sure if we should try to get rid of them concerning, for instance, the smoking situation. Historically speaking, have we had any real success on directing those taxes to the preventional side or to helping Black and brown folks? Or is that something that the struggle is now, how do we make the tax money that we're bringing in go to helping where the desperate impact is? And
it varies a lot by state. So for example, something like California, where they had a tax that is going to fund 0 to 5 programs, that money is being targeted in a way that is pretty good, in that if you just sort of look at the demographics and sort of the aging of the population, if you have your cigarette tax money going to healthcare or to social services or for kids in some way, that could help with the targeting and could help benefit populations. One of the things that we've also done some work on, and we, the one place where we would absolutely just say get rid of them right now are fees and fines, right? This is sort of in your wheelhouse. But some of the fines and forfeitures are some of the most discriminatory and punitive kinds of revenues that are raised. And in places where they've gotten rid of them, like for example, in San Francisco, where they abolished having to pay fees for people who are on bail. It didn't necessarily cost them that much money because they weren't actually getting that money in. But if you could actually get rid of those charges, you're keeping people from you can totally disrupt somebody's life if they have some sort of fine that they can't pay. If you're basically going to tell somebody that they're going to either lose their car, lose their license, or be sitting in jail because they can't pay a speeding ticket, that's just bad policy, and it's not raising money, and it's sort of some of the things that sort of isn't a lot of money, but can cause these really disproportionate outcomes. That is something we're new to starting to study and horrified by.
I just want to add one thought that has crossed my mind over the years, and I'm sure there must be research on this. Another reason to get rid of the fines and fees is I think in a way it suppresses voter participation. I have personally known people who have refused to register to vote because they have outstanding parking tickets and this kind of thing, right? All the more reason that those should be relied on a lot less by municipal governments. And I know, municipal budgets are stressed and everybody's up in arms over property taxes and, we need to have people pay more user fees who are using the court system and I know all the arguments, but I'm just saying it's occurred to me that some of this stuff is effectively turns into a voter suppression tool. That's my own 2 cents observation on that.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, I was just going to thank you both for that answer. I think you are amongst friends concerning that topic of fines and fees, and everyone will agree with you on that. But the end result is exactly, Chris, what you just hit on, which is many of the court systems have come to rely on those fines and on those fees, which goes right back to that initial question of where those taxes, those funds are coming in at, and the reliance on that. If we can't get rid of it here in Kansas, how do we, or where is the pressure point that we need to focus in on to assist in directing our legislator to take the funds and put them wherever we need them to go? And I'm done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So I was just going to say some of the most compelling evidence is if you actually take what other fines and fees come in and put that back up to the state and distribute them not directly, you can help at least mitigate the incentives for having more tickets being issued. Right? So it's exactly the opposite of wanting to direct money to where the benefit goes. If somehow we can get the local governments to benefit less from whatever fines they put into place, that can help mitigate these perverse incentives of trying to use the criminal justice system to raise money.
The other point I would make gets back to the earmarking discussion of a little while ago. Yes, obviously, cigarette taxes, if you earmark them to help with smoking cessation programs or to mitigate some of the social costs of smoking, that's good. But the problem in the real world is money is fungible, and the policymakers have very clever ways of playing a shell game. I mean, if you started some program from whole cloth and you begin providing grants or loans to minority-owned businesses, right? And you had a new tax or an increased tax or somehow paid for that, I think you'd be pretty confident knowing that's what's going to happen. But if a program already exists, what happens is they just end up cutting the money they were otherwise going to appropriate to the program when the new money comes in, right? I mean that's the problem. All money is fungible, and something like 81% of all state taxes go into the state general fund, which is sort of the mothership. And so if you did want to, you can earmark, but ultimately, if they want the money, they're going to take it back from you. That's just the reality of the budget process in Kansas and most states, I'm afraid.
Yeah, David Jordan here. Chris, I was really excited to see the slide that you had in there about sort of the recommendation on looking at other federal funding that makes up part of the state budget, and looking at the recommendations to look at how it impacts disparities. I think the context here, and I'd be curious as to what you think's driving it, is sort of when I had seen some data points a few years ago from Pew that said in 2006, Kansas was 23rd in the country in sort of the percentage of state budget made up by federal dollars. And in 2017, Kansas was 47th. And if you just look at early childhood dollars, Kansas is 48th in the country, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center. And of course, the programs that we're not drawing the federal dollars on are lean. So the fact that we don't have a robust safety net, it's negatively impacting people of color and low income folks. I didn't know, I mean, one, I didn't know, I guess two questions following that is like, have you heard of any research that sort of people are starting to look at that? Because I've been thinking like, it would be really interesting to look at how our outcomes in the areas of social determinants of health with a lens on race have sort of moved from 2006 to present day, and how we've sort of regressed as federal dollars have sort of declined. So I'd be curious if you knew if anyone was looking at that, or from a national level in other states. I think it could be really interesting to look across multiple states. But I'd also be curious from your perspective, sort of what you think is driving our sort of decline in federal dollars compared to other states. I'm sure Medicaid expansion is a big chunk of it, but I know TANF, CCDBG. I mean, I'm just curious as to sort of what where focus could be beyond Medicaid expansion to try to close some of the gaps that exist in federal dollars with an eye towards closing disparities and outcomes, across the board.
I think Medicaid's the big one.
Yeah.
And like, it could be interesting. So Donna Ginther, who does work with the tax commission, right? I think her shop at the university has been looking at a lot of sort of what not taking those Medicaid dollars has meant generally. And like, I feel like they've done some work looking at these kinds of questions. It would be really interesting to sort of do the comparison of the places that expanded and took the Medicaid match and didn't, to look at how that sort of played out.
Yeah, and I think the same. I think the same is also true for like our restrictive approach to TANF dollars and how it's resulted in lower number of kids getting child care subsidies and lower access to cash assistance, and how that's playing out. And there's probably some other behavioral health aspects. So I didn't realize Donna was doing the Medicaid expansion work. I think she might be a good resource to have this conversation with.
Yeah, and I don't dispute the finding that we may well be getting less federal dollars for other programs as well. But I will tell you, I did see just recently some farm income data, and the last couple of years, boy, the money has come crashing in because of sort of the trade war stuff. Trump put out a lot of extra money to sort of hold the ag community harmless, and it's been going on for a couple, 3 years. I don't think it's supposed to go on indefinitely. But there has been a lot of federal money pouring into the state for that reason.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I think it was proportion of the state budget, but I think it was through 17. So that's probably why we haven't seen that reflected in the data, which is helpful to know as well.
This is Shannon Portillo. I did just notice that we are at 4:15 and we asked our speakers to join us until 4 o'clock. I'm truly enjoying the conversation, and if you all wouldn't mind, I would ask for you to stick around just for a few more minutes for more questions if you're able to. If you're not, we completely understand, because we did say that our speakers are typically just in the first hour of our meeting. But if you have the time, we would appreciate additional time. I know that there are additional questions from commissioners.
I'm happy to stay.
Thank you.
This is Commissioner McCormick again. Thank you, Co-Chair Patillo. I was hoping that there was more time for questions. This kind of goes back to something Chris was saying. Weren't the outcomes of the experiment entirely predictable? Like my first question. And then second one, I was hoping that Kim could talk more about that shift from property taxes to sales taxes from the historical standpoint.
I'll let Kim tackle the latter, but in my mind, the outcome was entirely predictable. I was in a nonpartisan staff agency, worked for both political parties. I'm not going to lie to you, it was a stressful time to be in state government. People were wanting to, a lot of people, especially me, to suggest the results were going to turn out more the way Dr. Laffer and others had suggested. And they did not. And one silver lining out of all this, notwithstanding the ongoing damage that was done to the Kansas public sector, is around 2016, 2017, a lot of other states started talking about tax cuts. And one of the first questions they'd get was, well, we're going to cut taxes, but we're sure not going to do what Kansas did. Kansas became an example of what not to do for even tax cutting legislators in other states. We're still rather famously used as an example, and it may take many, many years or decades to live that down. But at least, maybe we're serving the greater good by being held up as a bad example in other states.
And yeah, so I did a couple of papers on like taxes and growth, which basically found no evidence that getting rid of your income tax led to more growth. And we had a couple of events and we would have panelists. So we had a couple of these events where it was me, somebody from the Tax Foundation, and somebody from CBPP. I've never had it be so consistent that everybody said that Kansas won the prize for the worst tax law of the year. And it was consistent, right? So if you have the Tax Foundation basically saying, this is really bad, and we know it's just going to have people shift how they declare income rather than actually do anything real, it was pretty self-evident. On the property tax versus sales tax, so there's a report by Mike Leachman out of CBPP, and then Vanessa Williamson, who's a colleague of mine at the Tax Policy Center, but on the Brookings side, they each have reports that do that. And you see, this is the problem with Arvin being gone, in that I have to figure out if I can send it to you at the same time. But Vanessa is working on a book looking at these kinds of questions. So she's a political scientist that should be coming out, but I'm going to see if I can do this and talk at the same time.
Well, and while you're looking that up, I'll give you a little, this is Shannon Portillo, Chair. I'll give you a little bit of space. Vanessa is who was featured in the article that we sent around as homework that I'm sure all of the commissioners read in preparation for this meeting. And so I'm very excited for her book to come out, but we can resend that article kind of featuring her work as well.
Okay, so was that including the most recent brief on taxes?
I'm not sure that it was. So if you have an additional link, that would be fantastic.
Yes, and I can always do it afterward. I'm going to go to the Tax Policy Center page where we should have it listed.
Well, as you're looking for those links, and this is Shannon Portillo, co-chair, Catalina and Chris have had some interesting discussion in the chat. Catalina was asking about tax holidays for school supplies, and Chris responded, I would love to just hear a little bit more, Chris, about what the findings are around tax holidays for school supplies.
There are a number of states that do that. Sort of the first weekend in August, they'll exempt clothes and computers and these kinds of things. And that bill's been introduced in Kansas over the years. And Kim probably knows this more than me, but there's a lot of literature I've seen that says those don't really work as intended. They're sort of burdensome for retailers to go through this 48 or 72-hour period where you don't charge sales tax on certain things. And also there's some suggestion that retailers simply adjust their price that weekend to offset it, let people think they're getting a break when in fact they're not. Yeah, I guess it's great if your kid's going to college and you need to run out and buy a computer. You know, there's people who push for this, but it's not cheap to do this. And there are states that do this. Missouri does it. And yeah, I'm sure there's Kansans that drive over to Kansas City, Missouri and buy their kids blue jeans and computers and all the rest of it. And so the argument is, boy, let's keep some of that money in state. But I don't know, Kim, you've seen some of that same literature that suggests that this isn't quite as effective as its proponents want it to be, right?
I think that's right. And part of it is it's not as well targeted, right? So for anything where you can actually limit who's getting it. So doing something like giving people an income tax rebate on what we think that their sales taxes would be, and especially if that's refundable. So it's really important for it to be refundable because you want the poorest people to also get it. Seems like it's more effective in terms of bang for your buck if you want lower income families to benefit.
Yeah, it's all about targeting. I remember some years ago, I visited my brother who was then living in back east, and we went to we visited the campus of Yale University, and I bought a hat. I went to buy a hat in the bookstore, and I went to pay for the hat. It was like $10, and I was like, "Well, where's the sales tax?" Well, it turns out Connecticut had a law. They may still have it. Items of clothing under $50 are not subject to sales tax. So they had thought about targeting, right? But I was some, 30-year-old yuppie or something at that time. I could afford the $10 for a hat. I didn't need the tax break on the damn hat, right? But at least there's some thought process where, as to Kim's point, the back to school weekend, anybody can go out and buy clothes or computers, whether you have kids or not, and regardless of your income, and avail yourself of that sales tax break. So it's not targeted necessarily to the low and moderate income people.
Yeah, and I don't know why I can't find this report. Oh, is this?
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. Chris, you had mentioned the food sales tax rebate that had gone away during the Brownback experiment, and now there is discussion of bringing it back, but it sounds like that may not get through this year. Can you kind of give a little bit more detail on where that's at in this legislative session and what we might expect or what we might consider for recommendations for our report?
Yeah, we introduced the bill, or had Representative Gartner introduce it for us on the House side. I'm pretty sure they had a public hearing on it. The old law, you had to meet both an income and a demographic test. You had to have your household income below a certain level, and then someone in the household had to be above age 55 or blind or otherwise disabled or be a dependent child under age 18. So you had to meet both an income and a demographic test to qualify. I think the demographic qualifying test might be out of the new bill. I haven't looked that closely at it. It's a slightly revamped program, but it's an effort to target it to a broader, I think, and Josh may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think 450,000 Kansas households would be able to get money under the newly revamped program. So a major expansion of it, and that $60 million would go out to the people who need it most, who've been most harmed by paying sales tax on their groceries. George Brett would not be able to claim a credit, right? So that was a notion. But again, that bill is just not moving. It hasn't even come out of committee. We've been talking about it for 2 or 3 years as one of the best ways to fix some of the damage that was done that's still lingering from the grand tax experiment. But so far, no dice, even at the same time that there's many tens of millions of dollars of tax relief being given to multinational corporations in a bill that's on the governor's desk.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. I do really appreciate all of your time, and I know we're getting really close to 4:30, and I want some time for the commissioners to kind of go over our next steps. But before we let you all go, our report is divided into 3 main areas. So recommendations that the executive branch and administrative agencies in the state can move forward, recommendations that will go to the legislature, and recommendations for local governments. And I've heard a few things. So first, obviously, we will be making a recommendation in support of the food sales tax rebate. I did hear about I-10s and being able to file with I-10s so that folks can claim that earned income tax credit in the state. And then potentially a first-time homeowner credit as a way to encourage home ownership from groups that have traditionally not been homeowners, as well as better data and transparency that can improve tax policy. Are there additional recommendations that you can think of in any of those 3 buckets, administrative agencies, legislature, or local governments, that we should be thinking about putting forward around tax policy?
I was going to say, if there's a way of having your administrative agencies like know who's getting the benefits, which I don't know if you can, because it depends if you're asking them about race. But some of this could also possibly be done by geography. So like, for example, it would be really helpful or interesting to know who got PPP loans, or if there's going to be investment in the ARP money, can we know who's benefiting from that? And Chris, you might have a better idea of whether that would be.
No, that's right. I think the notion of transparency and better data it's a tougher nut to crack on the expenditure side of the equation, but we need to go as far down that road as we possibly can. As I mentioned, the damage to making racial disparities worse from the previous administration's tax experiment wasn't just that the overall state tax system was made more regressive, but because of the damage to the public sector, a lot of state employees didn't get a raise for a decade. The major cuts to the state highway program, to social services, the foster care system was in crisis. There was all these other kinds of damage that was done to the public sector that is part of the issue as well. So as much as you can extend the data gathering and transparency notion along racial and ethnic lines to the expenditure side of the equation, I think that's going to help you as well.
Related to that, I guess, and one of the concepts that I know that we talked about raising as one of our sessions was some states like Oregon and Washington have implemented like equity assessments, almost like a fiscal impact statement. There's a racial equity impact statement that has to go on all legislation. I don't know if you know if anything like that has, and I can check with those 2 states, but has been applied to the expenditure side or just all fiscal policy, because that may be a way to cover that, or it may or may not work, which is part of the reason I'm asking if you know anything about that.
I don't know if it's too new. Like, Chris, do you know?
No, I don't. Those sound like really, I was not aware of that. And those sound like interesting templates, whatever their state specific metrics and measurements are. Those could be perhaps used as templates once the federal sort of stuff comes out, we could look at what Oregon and Washington has done and try and meld some of the what the feds are doing to a state-specific mandate for Kansas. I think that's very interesting, and I'd encourage you to follow up on that as well.
Okay, great, thanks.
This is Co-Chair Shannon Portillo. Do we have any final questions from commissioners? And Josh, I did notice you just came camera on. I don't know if you'd like to make any comments.
Oh, well, thank you. I just wanted to add, I think you've really effectively covered it, but there really can be an earmarking process, whether it's a tax issue or a budget issue. And so that gets back to the whole, well, whether it's a tax expenditure or a budget expenditure, who does that actually go to help? And so I don't know if that's something that can be adequately analyzed or studied, but frankly, when you have a political dynamic like we have in a lot of states, the ideas that come from certain legislators are much less likely to make it all the way through the process. And as a result, the cumulative effect of that really, I think, could be measurable, or at least there could be some data out there that would show how that political dynamic ends up impacting even down to the level of, there's special money that's earmarked for specific sales tax exemptions for specific entities. Well, do those fall across the entire state in an equitable manner? And I doubt that's the case. So that's just one thing I would mention.
Or even now, requests for property tax exemptions from particular industries because they're for-profits that believe they're competing with a nonprofit in the same area. And that is certainly not falling in equitable ways if that were to move forward. I mean, I do think that this discussion around the increased reliance on sales tax, particularly post-Reconstruction in the South, is really interesting because what we've seen at the state level is that when we had a property tax lid in place for local governments, we saw an increased reliance in many local governments on sales tax. And in the same way, we kind of shifted, right, as we were seeing this big experiment in Kansas with income taxes, we were also shifting at the local level from property taxes to sales taxes in a more regressive way. And so we have both at the state and local level an increased reliance on more regressive taxing, and it will take us a long time to dig out of those holes. I do thank you so much for being so generous with your time today, and we are excited to come to the Tax Policy Council meeting as well to kind of share what we are working through on our commission, and we really thank you for spending so much time with us this afternoon.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And this is Gabby.
Okay.
That is
Always a fan of pets making Zoom meetings a little bit better.
we're after 5 o'clock. She's like, I should be walking her right now.
Very fair. Well,
Thank you
very much.
Thanks for having us, and let Josh know who wants to appear at our next meeting. We haven't set the date yet. We think it'll be late April or early May, and I'll relay to the co-chairs that we had a fabulous time, and we look forward to seeing one of your members here in a few weeks.
Thank you very much. And for the commissioners, we're going to move into the second half of our meeting, though I promise that it will not take as long, so we will be done by 5 o'clock. But we're going to be talking about kind of our next steps. So Sophia prepared a really great document for us that kind of laid out in a table format some of our topics, and then also put some of the research that NGA has collected for us at the bottom of that document. So we can really just start moving forward with saying, here are recommendations in these 3 buckets. Here we have an additional column that we added. Sophia, if you want to share your screen, if you have that document ready, that would be fantastic. And then we have another column added for additional research. And so we've gotten quite a few reports shared with us today. I think many of these were also in our prep email, and we'll move some of those into the areas that we have around tax policy. But our goal is really to go back to our full commission meeting with some of this filled out with specific recommendations, so we can start really constructing that final report. And as I mentioned from kind of this meeting, I saw 4 big takeaways. And so I'll make sure that I do some of that updating in the tax policy row. We had a great discussion about broadband in our last subcommittee meeting, but I'll be honest, I didn't walk away with the specific recommendations. So if we have any commissioners who really want to claim a row within this table and start looking at the research that was pulled by NGA and some of the work that kind of we've been doing in the committee, or if you want to take lead on that particular week, if we're talking about it. So we will have in our next subcommittee meeting, our goal is to either talk really in depth about housing or to have a discussion about the American Rescue Plan. It really depends on where we're at with the American Rescue Plan and the infrastructure bill, and knowing kind of how that's going to move forward. So first off, any kind of questions or additional topics that we want to add, but then we'll go to the bottom and kind of look at those reports and hopefully divvy up those reports so we can each kind of lay claim to, we will take this on as a subcommittee member, read through the report and pull out any of those recommendations from the reports or research that we think might work well on our committee. So the standing questions in front of you are, 1, do you like this overall kind of layout strategy plan? 2, are there topics that we're missing? I included all the topics that we have for our subcommittee meetings. I added some new ones. We can add additional new ones if you'd like, based on research that we've been sharing. And then 3, which reports would you like to take on and volunteer to use as your homework so that you can fill out these particular sections if they've either already been done or if they're coming up in future meetings?
This is John Nate, Kansas AFL-CIO. I see one of your sections talks about the workforce. Are you talking about jobs and skill training, all of that in that category?
I think well, first, that's a great question, John, because I think that workforce, we really may have some subcategories in there, quite a few, actually. Some of the workforce pieces are what we talked about in our last subcommittee meeting with the Department of Commerce and some of their programs, and if we have any recommendations off of that conversation. But then other workforce pieces, I mean, as we hear this infrastructure bill being discussed, a significant portion of the infrastructure bill is really focused on workforce development. So I think if our committee has any specific recommendations around how we can make sure that workforce development is really considered through a racial justice lens, that would be fantastic. But I'm sure that given your position and your role, you probably have some additional thoughts on workforce and how we might expand on those recommendations and other sub areas that we might need there.
Yes, thank you.
Are you volunteering to take workforce on as your area?
That's fine.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Mr. Nave.
This is Brandon, University of Kansas. I'll look at the research on housing.
Thank you, Brandon. And that, like I mentioned, should be either our next meeting or we might do American Rescue Plan and infrastructure legislation, in which case it would be bumped to August. But there are quite a few reports that NGA has already compiled around housing. And then we'll, of course, do a session on that as well. And so feel free to get started on your homework early.
Okay. And then the rescue package stuff, I would volunteer for that too, if you need somebody to look at that.
And Sophia, why don't we just add like federal legislation as another row? and have the American Rescue Plan and infrastructure bill,
No, look,
and then put Brandon's name next to it. Thanks for the double volunteer there, Dr. Davis. We appreciate it. I do know that childcare and early childhood is going to be a topic that will be considered by multiple committees. I think that all three of our committees are actually considering taking that one on, and we might have a full kind of joint session on that. So I'm happy to take that particular section and coordinate with the other subcommittee co-chairs to just make sure that we're consistent across all three subcommittees on the childcare piece.
Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County District Attorney. As not to be the last one to go, I will volunteer for the student loans and education so that I can see who's about to take on reparations.
Student loans and education financing is also something that the education subcommittee is going to take on. So I would just encourage you to also coordinate with the education subcommittee. I will admit I put reparations on there because I was reading really interesting things that are coming out of Evanston, Illinois. They're actually implementing some local reparations policies, mostly focused on housing. But we've seen kind of increased conversations around reparations and housing specifically tied together. Since I put it on there, I'm happy to also take that one, since I recognize it may be the one that gets the most conversation from our commission, and we don't have a learning session on it yet, but I would love to create one. We've run out of weeks, but if we have interest, I'm sure that we can find a number of experts willing to come speak to our subcommittee. So if we have enough folks interested for a learning session, we can do it. If not, I will just go through the research and add some recommendations, and we can talk about them that way.
Add me to your reparations. Let's go down this road. I just read something nationally. They're looking at this and talking about it. So there's enough out there.
Fantastic. Then I will also work with Sophia and Kate. We might think about pulling together a learning session or bumping one of our subcommittees and adding this to a subcommittee agenda. Broadband is one that we already have some things done, so it would be some low-hanging fruit if anyone would like to volunteer for that one. We can also volunteer Jackson for it because he's missing our subcommittee meeting today. So I'm willing to volunteer an abstention for one of our smaller particular rows. Hearing no one else claim it, that one is going to be volunteered to Jackson Winsett. Tax policy, I think I have some pretty good notes, and so I can work with Sophia and Kate on just getting that one filled out a little bit more. Though we have quite a few reports to go through, so if anyone has additional things that come up as you're reading through everything that was shared today, please let me know. Transportation is something that's come up quite a bit just in some of our overall discussions. And I think as we think about the infrastructure bill, that might come up again. We have this on the list for a potential presentation, but it's near the end of the year. So this is one where we may ask our friends at NGA to suggest a few reports that we can pull and see if there are best practices from other states.
Co-Chair Portillo, this is Mark McCormick. I'd be interested in the childcare section.
Fantastic. Are there any sections that are missing?
I'd be interested in reparations as well.
See, it was going to be the most controversial, and now it has a majority of our subcommittee engaging in it. This tells me we need a learning session on it.
Mark Dupree, Wyandotte County DA, Madam Chair, what I received out of that, it also has the most controversial people on the committee.
Spoken like a true elected official. on our subcommittee as well, sir.
This is Commissioner McCormick. If it goes bad, we'll just blame you.
That's fair. Any additional areas that we should add as far as topics? One piece that we have talked about that I didn't kind of list as a separate topic is the racial wealth gap. A lot of that is kind of focused in housing and tax policy. So I think that we'll get at some of that through housing and tax policy recommendations. Though I don't know if we want that listed separately and to kind of discuss the racial wealth gap as a separate concept and where we can make recommendations about it.
This is Brandon, the University of Kansas. I think that instead of maybe not adding it as a separate thing, but I think we could probably make an argument for things that contribute to the wealth gap after we do these things. So instead of having it separate, we could just say, you know, because of taxes, housing, student loans, these things combined are contributing or you know, are more of a burden for people of color or low-income people or something like that.
Well, and some of what Commissioner Jordan was talking about earlier around TANF and some of the other social safety net, you know, the discussion was are we pulling down federal funds that we could or not? But some of what our state has done is enacted very specific administrative burdens in order to access some social safety net pieces and administrative burdens for other kind of basic pieces of government. And I think that when we think about administrative burdens, that is something that also has a disproportionate effect on people of color in communities. I'm not sure if we want to think about administrative burdens as another separate topic or one that is kind of woven throughout each of these areas.
I had a different question. This is Commissioner McCormick. I was thinking about the federal legislation line that we have there and transportation. And I've been hearing a lot about rail service and interstate rail service. I'm wondering if in this state, it would require federal legislation in order to develop a high-speed train line from Kansas to Texas or from here to St. Louis, or I'm just wondering.
I mean, I think the short answer is yes. And I'm interested to see how much kind of focus on train infrastructure remains in the infrastructure bill as it moves through the legislative process. And so I think that's something for us to kind of keep our eyes on and see if that will be part of our June discussion or August discussion.
This is John Nave, Kansas FLCL. In that response to Mark on that, there has been over the years discussion from some political leaders across Kansas about that very same thing about high-speed transit from Kansas City, Kansas, all the way down through Texas. But that then the pushback would be then you're pushing against the revenue from the Kansas Turnpike. And you know, so those that are running that operation would be highly against that. But that's been a discussion from over the years on various levels, which I would think it would be great to have something like that here in the state of Kansas.
So that may be another one where it would be good to bring in an expert to have some conversations around different types of transportation infrastructure, and how we might think about that through a racial justice lens.
I think that will also probably, sorry, this is David Jordan. It may also be timely with some of the infrastructure opportunities that exist, because I think there's going to be significant investment in those infrastructure opportunities around rail. So that could be directed towards the right communities that might be timely. Sorry.
Okay, so this is Chair Shannon Portillo. So what we will do is follow up with each of you on the homework that you have, or the row that you have accepted, the specific policy area, and go through the NGA research that we currently have and make sure that you have links to those reports in that particular research, and let you know if it's on one of our future dates or if it's already passed. So for example, with broadband, we already had that. So I think we're ready to move forward with recommendations there. Tax policy, I'll make sure that we're ready to move forward with recommendations and continue to go through the homework that we were given here. As I mentioned, housing, we have quite a few reports, but then we'll also have one of our meetings focus on housing. We'll bring in some experts. So Brandon, if you have any initial thoughts when reading through what NGA has already shared, you can start drafting some recommendations, but then we'll also have that at a later date so we can add to that list. And then we'll just think about this draft as kind of a draft and working ideas. So we'll make sure that the subcommittee has a chance to talk through this, and then this is what we'll also share when we have those full committee meetings. Since we are at a bit of a disadvantage, we have to remember all of our work for 6 weeks. I'm hoping that having a document will help us kind of with some of that report out when we have our full commission meetings. Any other big thoughts, ideas, or announcements for the good of the group?
Sounds good.
Yeah, very
Hi,
good.
all, everyone. Oh, sorry. Sophia Johnson here, the CREJ intern. I just wanted to let you all know that NGA, like specifically Rachel Stevens, who's on this call too, she's already offered to do additional research on information or collect more data. So if there's anything that you come across during some of your research and want more NGA help from it, you can reach out to me or Rachel specifically, and I can coordinate with Shannon about giving that contact information when we send this out to you.
This is Brandon Davis, University of Kansas. I will take whatever they get coming up on the infrastructure bill or the ARP as it comes in, so they can just funnel that, as they get it, they can just funnel it to me.
Thank you. This is David Jordan. Thank you for letting me crash the subcommittee meeting. This was a great discussion. So I appreciate it. I think there's some good overlap with some of the things we're tackling too on workforce and childcare. So looking forward to bringing this all together.
This is Chair Shannon Portillo. You're not crashing at all. All of these are open to everyone. We're really excited you're here for this conversation. And I think you're exactly right. There's going to be a lot of overlap in a lot of these areas from all three committees. And so it will be interesting. I think that this report can get quite lengthy pretty quickly because we had about 60 recommendations in our report in December. And I can already think through just this subcommittee is probably going to end up with quite a few. And when we add on the other two subcommittees, we have a lot to say as a commission, and I'm looking forward to seeing it all come together. Well, I am happy to see that Mark Dupree didn't have to go through 4 cups of coffee to stay awake for this conversation, though that was the thread earlier. As I said, tax policy is super fun, and I think we all had a solid time a week before tax day, even though it's been pushed back this year. I really appreciate you all indulging me in this particular topic, since I know it's one that doesn't sound like it's fun, but it has really important racial justice implications. And I really appreciate the speakers that came to speak to us today, because I think they did a great job of highlighting all of that work. So thanks for having the conversation this afternoon. And Sophia, do you have anything else for us before we wrap up?
I don't believe so. But yeah, anything else I'll have in my notes from this meeting, I can also send out as well if we want to review it for later.
Thank you. All right, I hope that you all have a really wonderful evening.
Take care, everyone. Be blessed.
Thank you.